Hi, I'm John Fuller, environmental campaigner for 35 years. I've been involved in a really big piece of work over the last 15 months, trying to force the BBC to tell the truth on climate change. A really big strand of work. I decided that there were three main areas in which the BBC was failing. So I took three complaints through the BBC's complaints process and then took them on to Ofcom, which is the BBC's external regulator. Just give you a quick run through what actually happened and then what we're proposing to do now going forwards. The first complaint was back in July of 2018 when the Heathrow vote was taken in Parliament. One of the issues that's always annoyed me with the BBC is that it's never told the public about the costs of climate change. It always talks about Heathrow and the benefits of expanding Heathrow, the financial benefits of fracking, whatever it may be. But nobody talks about the financial negatives. The COP21 agreement commits us to paying for negative emissions to take out of the atmosphere the CO2 that we dump there today that takes us over 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's a vast cost, perhaps as much as £125,000 per person in the UK. The BBC never talks about the costs of adaptation. It never talks about the COP21 commitment for us to pay loss and damage compensation. So the first complaint was about, if you like, a bias really, the bias the BBC has against the young. And I took that through the process, started that process in July. The second area is the area that's of greatest concern perhaps to Extinction Rebellion and probably, people, all campaigners really, and that is the news that the BBC doesn't cover. Virtually every week there'll be a major piece of news that BBC doesn't cover. And the one I chose to pick up on was again in July when the United Nations had a very frightening conference about the security implications of climate change, and the BBC didn't touch it at all. That sort of led into the UN Secretary General's speech of September of last year, 2018, when the UN Secretary General warned that we now face a direct existential threat and the possibility of runaway climate change. And the BBC didn't cover that on the main TV or radio programmes. It did cover that one online, but censored out the words direct existential threat. So the main issue with complaint number 2 is the news that the BBC just doesn't cover. Then the third complaint I took through the BBC's process involved the July heatwave across the whole of the Northern Hemisphere. There are a number of scientists who, mainstream scientists, they call them alarmists. They would say that they are realists. But that body of scientific opinion that says that we are on the very cusp of runaway climate change, or that it may actually have already begun, the BBC does not give a voice to that body of opinion. But it does give a voice to the climate change deniers. Recently it's announced that the deniers will get much less time on air, but they still will allow the deniers to have access. But I can't see them so far giving access, the same amount of access to the airways as to the people who say, the scientists who argue that runaway climate change has begun. So these three complaints went through the BBC's complaints process, and then I took them on to Ofcom. But during that process, a lot came out. For example, the BBC confirms it has got detailed guidance on how it tackles climate change that it gives to presenters and editors, but it wouldn't release it to us. So I asked a friend, Dave Hampton. He fired off a Freedom of Information request, and the Freedom of Information request was refused by the BBC. They cited the exemption of journalism. There is a special exemption for journalism, which is kind of ironic given the fact that this is all about the BBC covering up news, not reporting news. And the letter from the BBC did say that if we were able to overturn that exemption, if we went to the Information Commissioner, then they would perhaps fall back on another exemption. And several of us discussed that, and we thought the only other one would be national security. Anyway, during the process, this whole process, we discovered that a lot of pressure was being put on the BBC, and it began to change, and there was real evidence of change occurring at the BBC from around about August, September onwards. A lot more was being covered, but still the really frightening news was not reaching the public. When we went to Ofcom, first reply I got back was pretty dismissive. And I was really surprised by one element to the dismissal of my complaints on complaint issue number 1 and in complaint number issue number 3. Ofcom said that they considered that the BBC's human rights were vital in this matter, and that they overrode other issues. So the human rights they cited were BBC's right to freedom of expression. I believe freedom of expression is incredibly important, but freedom of expression does not override an absolute human right that we have to life. We also have the rights to property and to family. So I was astonished that Ofcom should say that the BBC's human rights to freedom of expression were more important than other people's right to life. The other thing that came out from the first response from Ofcom was that it is a post-broadcast regulator and it has no power to intervene over the BBC in the way that if it chooses not to report an issue, then Ofcom cannot intervene. So BBC, in effect, can continue to hide from the public really major important pieces of news. Just in the last week, there have been a couple of items. There's been a major national security conference in Munich, not covered by the BBC, and there's been data being released in the last week in connection with methane, the rising methane emissions in the atmosphere, again not covered by the BBC. So Ofcom have told us they cannot intervene in that. The way that the Ofcom was set up, the statute, the law that was passed, prevents it from intervening. So really, Ofcom can't help us with perhaps our biggest concern. So, but it's possible that if we had taken their other two decisions on complaints 1 and 3 to judicial review, it is possible we could have had the Ofcom decisions overturned. So I've got two lawyer friends who have agreed to meet and discuss what the options are and then advise me on the best way forward. I had hoped that the meeting would take place last week, but Tim is advising Extinction Rebellion on the legal strategy for defence, defending people who are prosecuted for any action that they might take. So he's incredibly busy at the moment, so they've not been able to meet. So I haven't had the best, if you like, legal advice on the wisdom of going for judicial review. I think that if we did choose to do that, I think that there wouldn't be a problem with the money because we could raise it through a crowdfunder. But I don't want people to lose sight of the fact, though, that the biggest issue of concern to most of climate change activists is the news that the BBC doesn't report. So if we can't overturn that at judicial review, is it wise to go for judicial review at this point? So what we've decided to do, a lot of us have been discussing this over the last few weeks, and the plan of action at the moment is that I will take another perhaps 5 complaints through the BBC's process that focus solely upon the BBC's refusal to tell the public about negative emissions, about loss and damage compensation, cost of adaptation. The BBC just is so embarrassing that for people to know, BBC executives to know, that every flight they take, for example, every car trip they take, if those carbon dioxide emissions take us over 1.5 degrees Celsius, their own children or grandchildren have to pay to take that back out of the atmosphere. And it's so embarrassing that people just don't want to talk about it. Well, my objective is to force people to talk about it. So I'm going to take 5 more complaints back through the BBC's complaints process, focusing just upon that one element. And it might be possible then to force Ofcom to confront that issue. Perhaps then they'll give a ruling that the BBC must stop this bias against the young and start telling the truth on that one issue. But when we come to the main issue of concern to people, which is this refusal to report really crucial, frightening news, then I think we've got to go for the political process there. So a few of us have been discussing this, and we've set up a Facebook group called BBC Tell the Truth. Now, there are lots of ideas that people can draw from that Facebook group on the kinds of pressure they can exert upon government ministers. The key point we want to get across to government ministers is that the very fact that the BBC does not report this frightening news is of itself a national security threat. People are being denied the chance to demand the changes that are needed in terms of energy policy that would have kept their own families alive. If people knew the frightening truth, more people would demand change. If people knew the frightening threat that there exists to our food supply, then people would demand greater resilience be built into our food supply. So I really think that it's very important that people emphasise this if they write to government ministers, that the BBC's cover-up is of itself a national security threat. So we need government ministers to intervene, tell the BBC, you've got to tell the truth to the public. So I'll be meeting with Extinction Rebellion activists over the next week or two. I'll be taking my 5 complaints back through the BBC's process again. We've got a Facebook group set up. And if you want to know more from me about this, then email me. I'm at john_n_fuller@hotmail.com. I also do a talk about everything that we learned as a result of going through the BBC's process. 20 minutes, perhaps half an hour. It really is interesting. There are quite a few surprises in that I haven't got time to get into this brief talk, but I hope I've updated you on where we are now. Thanks.